On the morning of June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched a sudden attack. Every Egyptian airbase was hit at the same time. In just 3 hours, Egypt's Air Force was in ruins. Planes were destroyed right on the runways. The strike didn't stop there. It extended to Syria. In 2 hours, their Air Force was crushed. In Jordan, it took only 10 minutes. The entire Air Force was wiped out. After gaining air superiority, Israeli forces advanced into Sinai. They caused massive destruction. Egyptian forces were wiped out. The attack didn't stop at Egypt. Israeli forces continued their march. They moved into the Golan Heights. Things began to spiral out of control. Moshe Dayan and his officers entered the old city of Jerusalem. They insisted on documenting the moment. Israeli troops pushed further. They crossed into the West Bank. 9 hours later, they reached the heart of Ramallah. Egypt lost more than 15,000 of its finest sons. Their bodies and remains scattered across the Sinai desert. The sand soaked in the blood of martyrs. Nearly 5,000 Egyptian soldiers were captured. Their weapons and equipment were seized. What led Egypt and the Arabs into a war that destroyed their armies? A war that cost the lives of thousands of the best young men. It left a deep wound, still echoing in the collective memory today. The story began in Cairo. After midnight on May 13, 1967, a convoy arrived, led by Mr. Mohammed Anwar Sadat, Speaker of the Egyptian Parliament. Sadat carried a warning from the Soviet Union. It contained confirmed intelligence about Israel's plans to invade Syria. Sadat rushed to Nasser's office. He found Nasser meeting with General Abdul Hakim Amr. In a region struggling with poverty, Egypt stood strong. A mutual defense agreement existed between Egypt and Syria. At the time, tensions were high across the Middle East, especially between Syria and Israel. The Soviet warning was credible.
Nasser began to confront the situation as an impending aggression against both Syria and Egypt. Given the Arab alliances, he had no choice but to act. Otherwise, his position among the Arab nations would become extremely difficult.
On the morning of May 14th, Marshal Abdul Hakim Amr held a meeting with General Mohammed Fawzi, Chief of Staff. Amr assured President Nasser that the Egyptian army was ready to face Israel. Orders were given for the mobilization of the Egyptian military. The Egyptian army was exhausted. It had been embroiled in a guerrilla war in Yemen. The military high command called up a large number of reserves. Most of them came from the densely populated Nile Delta. Thousands of reservists received mobilization orders. They were farmers, poorly trained and inexperienced in warfare. In the hours after the mobilization decision, 3 Egyptian army divisions advanced. They included 45,000 soldiers, 300 modern tanks, 450 armored personnel carriers, and a large number of Soviet artillery. The scene was grand, as they paraded through the streets of Cairo. It looked more like a military display than a serious military advance. News spread of the Egyptian army's advance, and the consequences were severe. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and entered Sinai, preparing for war. On May 15th, the Israelis held their Independence Day celebration in Jerusalem. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, his defense minister, and senior Israeli military leaders were present. During the military parade, the Prime Minister learned of the Egyptian mobilization, but he showed no concern. The celebration continued, and the Israeli public felt no sense of threat. Israeli Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin advised the Prime Minister to mobilize an armored division. 3,000 reserve soldiers were called up, and the military waited for further news on Egyptian escalation. An Israeli intelligence committee met at the Ministry of Defense. They believed Egypt's preparations weren't a sign of war. Instead, they viewed it as a tactic to intervene if Syria were attacked. At that time, Israel didn't have television. However, Egyptian TV had broadcast footage of the military mobilization. News reached Israel. Nasser verified the Soviet intelligence. He confirmed there were no Israeli movements toward the Syrian front. This meant war could have been avoided. But the military had already mobilized. As a pan-Arab hero, Nasser couldn't back down. He had ignited a cause he couldn't stop. At that time, Arab nationalism was the rallying cry. It was the banner that Nasser used to unite the Arab world. Nasser felt he could use this situation to polish the image of Arabs on the global stage.
The main reason Arabs loved Nasser was his unwavering belief in Arab nationalism. It was a dream that ignited a fire in the hearts of Arabs everywhere. But then came Arab nationalism, like a rallying cry that called them to rise, to stand together as one powerful entity, no longer isolated or powerless. It was a vision that gave them hope, a hope that unity would restore their strength, dignity, and rightful place on the world stage.
When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt, but they were forced to withdraw. However, the withdrawal from Sinai after its occupation in 1956 came at a cost. Nasser's victory was incomplete. He had to make concessions for the Sinai withdrawal. The first was the presence of a UN peacekeeping force in Sinai. The second was allowing the Strait of Tiran to remain open to Israeli shipping. For 10 years, the situation remained stable. No major issues or violations from either the Egyptian or Israeli military. On May 16, 1967, General Mohammad Fawzi, Chief of Staff of the Egyptian Armed Forces, sent a letter to General Indar Jit-Rihai, the commander of the UN emergency forces in Sinai and Gaza. In the letter he stated,
I inform you that I have issued orders to all armed forces to be prepared to act against Israel, should it take any hostile action against any Arab nation. In line with these orders, our forces have assembled in Sinai along Egypt's eastern borders. To ensure the safety of the international peacekeeping forces, I request that you issue orders for their immediate withdrawal. I have also instructed the commander of the Eastern Military Region regarding this matter.
Egyptian forces began pressuring the UN troops. They forced the UN out of several border positions. By evening, the Egyptians evacuated the UN from the Sava Center. Egypt and Syria declared their forces were ready for combat. Jordan followed, mobilizing its army. Lebanon canceled a planned visit from U.S. 6th Fleet ships. On May 18th, Egyptian and Palestinian forces pushed the UN to evacuate all its centers. Most UN troops withdrew to their camps in Rafah and Khan Yunis. Egyptian and Palestinian soldiers replaced them. On the other side of the border, the Israelis watched the last of the UN troops leave. There was no longer any buffer between the Israeli and Egyptian armies. Yet, Nasser had stepped into a bigger gamble than the one in 1956. On May 19th, for the first time in months, Egyptian MiG planes breached Israeli airspace. They flew over the Dimona nuclear reactor in the Negev. On May 20th, Marshal Amer toured the former UN positions. The 20th Palestinian Division occupied the Gaza Strip, while Egyptian forces controlled other areas. He ordered the mobilization of more reserve troops. In Cairo, Ahmed al-Shakiri announced in a press conference, The 8,000-strong PLO forces were now under the command of Egyptian, Syrian, and Iraqi leaders. On May 22, 1967, Egyptian military intelligence leaked news. Egypt had closed the Strait of Tiran to ships with the Israeli flag. This also applied to ships carrying military supplies to Israel. On May 23, Nasser announced the closure of the Tiran Straits. He declared that Israeli ships and those carrying strategic materials to Israel would be blocked. Nasser was in a strong position. The straits were difficult to navigate due to rocks. Only one passage led to the Gulf of Aqaba. This passage was vulnerable to fire from Ras Nasrani in Sharm el-Sheikh. Egypt had regained control of this area after peacekeepers withdrew. In Cairo, Nasser met with U Thant, the UN Secretary-General. Nasser demanded a return to the status quo of 1948. He also wanted recognition of the Gulf of Aqaba as Egyptian waters. Nasser insisted that Israel respect the demilitarized zone. He asked for international forces along Israel's borders. After reaffirming the rights of Palestinian refugees, Nasser told U Thant that Egypt would not strike first. The Egyptian army was large. It was poorly trained and weaker than the Israeli army.
The Soviet Union was supplying Egypt with weapons, but they were not of the quality that would allow the Egyptians to counter Israel's air superiority. Marshal Amer was in full control of the army, in addition to being promoted from major to marshal and given command of the military, something that was highly improper.
Nasser visited the Air Force headquarters. He was accompanied by Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amer. Nasser announced the closure of the Strait of Tiran. He addressed the world, saying he trusted his army. He added, "If the Jews want war, they are welcome." On March 23, 1967, at exactly 2:30 a.m., the phone rang at the home of the Israeli Prime Minister's military advisor, Colonel Liev. He was informed that the Egyptian army had closed the Strait of Tiran. Later that morning, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol met with military leaders, including Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin and Intelligence Chief Aaron Yariv. The attendees agreed that Israel must respond forcefully to maintain the balance of power in the region. Rabin recommended going to war immediately. After a lengthy meeting, the Israeli government decided to delay the decision for 48 hours. The Israeli foreign minister was sent on a trip to Europe and the United States to consult and pressure Egypt's allies to convince Egypt to reverse its decision and reopen the strait. In Cairo, the official radio was mobilized to support the government's policy and ignite the enthusiasm of the entire Arab public. The voice of the Arabs radio station reached across the Arab world. The public became excited, filled with confidence that their armed forces could obliterate Israel. The Palestinians were the most enthusiastic and loving towards Nasser. After the establishment of Israel in 1948, most Palestinians were displaced and became refugees in Jordan and Gaza. No Arab country accepted this bitter reality. Instead, Arab nationalism grew, along with the desire for independence and freedom from occupation. By 1967, Palestinians' hopes of returning to their homes and farms were higher than ever. People saw Nasser as the hero of the Arabs, especially the Palestinians. His image was even placed on prayer rugs in Palestine. To them, he was an extraordinary hero.
شيء يعني خيال
There's no doubt that Nasser had a remarkably advanced Arab vision for his time, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf. He became the ultimate model of the long-awaited historical figure. Sure, a few voices claimed he was blah blah blah, but the truth is, the entire Arab world followed him. The Arab world was ready to sacrifice itself for the sake of a successful Arab project.
By late May 1967, the scene in Egyptian streets began to change. So did the radio and television, which were accustomed to stirring the enthusiasm of the public. However, a historic shift occurred in the direction of Egyptian broadcasting. The Egyptian radio began broadcasting in Hebrew through the voice of the Arab station. This propaganda had a significant impact on Israel. At the time, there was no Israeli television station, so Egyptian television programs were closely watched. Meanwhile, Egyptian newspapers and magazines started publishing caricatures showing the crushing of Israel and the destruction of its army. Some images depicted Israel as crushed, penetrated, and destroyed in an imminent war, creating fear in the hearts of Israelis. The Israeli government prepared for the worst-case scenario in its history. Rabbis dedicated public parks to be used as mass graves. The Israeli public was called to donate blood, and trenches were dug. At the same time, Israel mobilized its reserve forces and prepared its army for war. The Egyptian propaganda had a significant impact beyond Egypt's borders. Demonstrations were organized in European countries to support Israel. The world began to fear another Holocaust. Israel exploited the Egyptian propaganda and the caricatures in Egyptian newspapers. They claimed that Egyptians wanted to throw them into the sea, a term repeated by some Arab leaders. Nasser was compared to the new Nazis, and the Holocaust issue was reopened, but this time at the hands of Nasser. Despite the profound impact of Egyptian propaganda on the Israeli people and the world, Israeli military leaders held a private view. They believed that the Arab armies would not be able to crush them. They knew the balance of power in the Middle East very well and were fully aware of the actual capabilities of the Arab armies at that time. Hebrew newspapers began publishing caricatures. They showed Eshkol being crushed by Egyptian tanks while he slept. The Israeli public began to demand, "Give us a general. Give us a military leader." As a result, the Israelis demanded a change in leadership. The choice fell on General Moshe Dayan, hero of the Suez Crisis. A small war cabinet was formed under Dayan's leadership. They met secretly in an underground location. The UN Secretary-General U Thant and the head of UN forces traveled to Cairo. They tried to influence Nasser and save the situation, but Nasser stood firm. He invited them both to dinner. They were the last foreigners to speak with him before the war. Nasser found himself facing a harsh reality. The Arabs supported his invasion of Israel. Arab armies and people demanded war. They wanted to deliver the first blow to Israel. But what was the Soviet Union's stance on the war? Nasser sent his Minister of War, Shams Badran, to Moscow. He sought to gauge whether the Soviets would support the Arabs in the conflict. After talks, Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin responded, "We cannot approve a preemptive strike against Israel or the start of hostilities. If you launch a preemptive strike, you will be the aggressor. This goes against our policy. We cannot support the aggressor." Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban met with U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, who was embroiled in the Vietnam War at the time. Israel hoped that President Johnson would send his fleet to open the Strait of Tiran by force. But Israel's request was rejected. Johnson replied that Israel would not be alone unless it chose to be alone.
He said the Vietnam War restrained, frustrated, and cornered him. "I won't be able to carry out what was planned at the time. Opening the straits by force, with American support." Then, in a vaguely rhetorical tone, he added, "Israel will not stand alone unless it chooses to stand alone."
King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo without an official invitation to meet Nasser. This came after years of estrangement. From Nasser's perspective, King Hussein was just a puppet controlled by the British and Americans. Before his visit to Egypt, King Hussein told Western diplomats that Nasser's closure of the straits was madness. He believed it would have disastrous consequences for the Arabs. Yet Hussein came to Cairo to meet Nasser. He knew that if a war broke out in the region, Israel would attack and occupy the West Bank and Jerusalem. Hussein feared Israel might even advance into the Jordan Valley from the west. He needed Arab support to defend the West Bank. This could only happen if he reconciled with Nasser, the leader of the Arabs. King Hussein proposed to Nasser that an Egyptian officer should lead his forces. Nasser told the Soviet ambassador, "I have invaded Jordan without sending a single soldier." General Moshe Dayan became the new Minister of Defense. This meant that Israel was committed to war. Dayan declared that Israel would take the initiative. It didn't matter who fired first. The key was to act quickly. The government voted on the decision. 12 members supported it, while 2 opposed. Dayan proposed the wording of the decision. The government left the decision of when to attack to the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister. June 5th was an ordinary day in Cairo. The Israeli Air Force executed a plan it had been training for years. Almost all Israeli aircraft launched from their bases at once. The Air Force targeted every airbase in Egypt simultaneously. The planes flew at low altitudes to avoid radar detection. They struck the runways to prevent Egyptian planes from taking off. Then they destroyed Egyptian planes parked on the ground. In just 3 hours, Egypt's Air Force was devastated. 338 out of 420 aircraft were destroyed. This included both jet fighters and bombers. Precisely 8:15 a.m. The people of Cairo gathered eagerly around their radios, awaiting news updates. What they received were misleading reports of fabricated victories. News of dozens of Israeli planes being shot down filled the airwaves. The broadcasts painted a picture of triumph, bravery, and unparalleled success. Jubilant crowds celebrated in the streets, their spirits lifted by tales of heroic engagements in Sinai and impressive military feats.
The attacking aircraft would take out 3 or 4 planes on a runway with a single strike.
Just 5 minutes after we took off, the control tower contacted me and said, "Sir, there's an attack on the airport." I asked, "An attack? What attack?" He said, "The airport is under fire." I replied, Which airport is under fire? He said, the loaded planes are being hit. Some have exploded, and they're targeting the runway now. I was in complete shock. Turns out the attack had been going on for 10 minutes already.
At the same time, the Israeli Air Force launched a similar strike against Syria, wiping out its air power within 2 hours. The Jordanian Air Force was destroyed in just 9 minutes. Without air support, any chance of Arab victory was lost. The devastating aerial assault crippled the Egyptian military, casting a heavy shadow over the ground battles that followed.
We spotted 2 dark-colored planes approaching. Before we knew it, bombs were already dropping on the runway. Boom, boom, boom. I ran, spotted a trench and jumped in, finding it packed with people, including my squadron leader. I said, "It's over." He snapped, "Stop that defeatist talk." I replied, "Defeatist? We're not the only ones getting hit. The whole Air Force must be under attack."
On the morning of June 5th, Field Marshal Amer was on an aerial tour over Sinai, making preparations for a war he did not yet realize had already begun.
We were all waiting for the arrival of the Marshal Amer. Suddenly, we heard an explosion, then another. We rushed out to see what was happening, only to find the very air base we were in under attack. What happened? I can say I expected it, but I never expected it to be this extreme.
War broke out, but the Israeli public knew nothing. Sirens echoed across Tel Aviv. People fled to bomb shelters. General Moshe Dayan had issued strict orders. No statements about the war were allowed. Israeli radio offered only one announcement. Fierce battles were underway. Egyptian forces were heavily engaged. After the success of the first airstrike, ground forces advanced. 70,000 soldiers and 700 tanks moved in. The plan was precise: a synchronized ground and air assault. The Egyptian command expected an attack from the north or center, but Israel struck from the south, creating widespread chaos. The battles began in Gaza. The Egyptian army, supported by the 20th Palestinian Division, fought fiercely. But with Israel's air superiority, Gaza fell after 2 days. Over 2,000 Egyptian soldiers were martyred. After Gaza, Israeli forces advanced toward Al-Arish. It quickly fell after a brief battle on its outskirts. At Katef, defenders met a grim fate, either killed or captured. In Abu Ajila, the battle was bloodier. Israeli forces encircled the area and carried out an airborne landing. Confusion spread among Egyptian artillery. The battle lasted 3 days. Despite the Egyptians' resilience, aided by minefields and the rugged terrain, Israel prevailed thanks to its air support. The Israeli Air Force was decisive. In contrast, the Egyptian Air Force made only 150 sorties over 4 days with little impact. On June 6th and 7th, Sharon secured southern Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh, advancing toward the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, Israeli Navy boats supported by paratroopers seized the southern coast. They lifted the blockade on the Strait of Tiran, reopening the route to Eilat. By June 8th, the war in Sinai had ended. Ras Seder on the western coast fell, leaving behind a tragic scene of destruction and losses. The Jordanian army was led by Egyptian General Abdul Munaim Riyad. King Hussein asked Nasser for this. Neither King Hussein nor General Riyad got updates on the war. They only received reports from Voice of the Arabs.
A battle suddenly began in the afternoon. Communication devices were jammed. No signals, just broadcasts from Voice of the Arabs, which I believe gave inaccurate information.
Israel knew King Hussein had no control. They sent him a message. They asked him not to join the war. 3 hours after the war began, Brigadier General Abdul Munaim Riyad, the commander of the Jordanian army, issued an order to bomb the Israeli part of Jerusalem. This opened a new front in the war, no longer confined to Sinai. Jerusalem, the capital of clouds, is a sacred city. It has holy sites for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. During the 1948 war, Israel failed to save the Jewish part of the city. As a result, Jerusalem was divided. The eastern part, or the Old City, was under Jordanian control. The western part was under Israeli occupation. To the south, there was a demilitarized zone, where a UN force was stationed. The Jordanian forces occupied the United Nations demilitarized compound after crossing the 1948 ceasefire line. A few hours later, Israeli forces moved to reclaim the UN compound. By the last hours of the same day, the UN center was freed from Jordanian control. But the situation didn't end there. A ground war began in Jerusalem, and Moshe Dayan decided to continue it. He withdrew paratroopers from Sinai to help in the battle for Jerusalem. Nasser and Speaker of the People's Assembly, Anwar Sadat, learned of the disaster that befell the Egyptian army. Sadat was stunned by the shock and took a long walk through Cairo's streets. In his diary, he wrote, "I was shocked, and my heart broke when I saw people cheering and dancing upon hearing the false reports of a fictional victory." Both Sadat and Nasser isolated themselves in a war room. Nasser reflected on the devastating defeat, unable to face the Egyptian people with the truth of what had happened. On the evening of June 5, 1967, the Israeli government gathered to discuss the issue of Jerusalem. Moshe Dayan was absent from the meeting, clearly making the decision independently of the government. After the paratroopers arrived from Sinai, the ground assault on Jerusalem began, a battle that would determine the fate of the city for decades. Fierce fighting broke out in Jerusalem and its suburbs. By dawn, the Jordanian forces collapsed, and both sides suffered heavy losses. But it didn't end there. Israeli forces spread through the Al-Aqsa Mosque area and began the process of taking control of the Old City. Israeli forces arrested Jerusalem's leaders, as the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound was the last stronghold of Arab civilian rule in Jerusalem. On the Temple Mount, Israeli soldiers found a small gate leading to the Western Wall. They rushed through it, reached the wall, and began chanting their Jewish prayers. Moshe Dayan and his officers entered the Old City of Jerusalem and insisted on documenting that moment. Outside Jerusalem, things began to spiral out of control. What started as a response to the Jordanian army's attack escalated into a full-scale war. Israeli forces advanced into the West Bank, and after 9 hours, they reached deep into Ramallah. However, the West Bank was vast, covering about 6,000 square kilometers, with a population of around 1 million Palestinians, many of whom were refugees, since the 1948 Palestinian War. The Israeli army advanced to secure the route between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. They evacuated 3 villages, displacing about 6,000 Palestinians from their homes. The village of Imwaz was wiped off the map. Israel demolished the houses and planted trees where the three villages once stood. The entire area was turned into a national park. In Sinai, Israeli forces breached the first line of defense, but the Egyptian army remained unharmed. Field Marshal Amer felt disheartened and ordered an immediate withdrawal from Sinai. The Israelis learned of Amer's decision to retreat and set a trap for the Egyptian army during their withdrawal. Instead of engaging in direct confrontation, they devised a plan to encircle and chase the retreating Egyptian forces.
Who gave the withdrawal orders? To this day, no one knows who issued the command to retreat.
The decision to retreat was hasty and unplanned. Egyptian command gave no details to the trapped forces, no safe route, no structured withdrawal plan. The only instruction was to retreat through Mitla Pass, a narrow, treacherous mountain path, later known as the Road of Death.
If I had withdrawn according to their orders, the battalion would have been completely wiped out. But I retreated through the central route.
The Israelis learned of Marshal Amer's decision to withdraw Egyptian forces. They seized this golden opportunity. Instead of engaging in direct confrontation, they devised a cunning plan, a strategy to encircle the retreating forces and pursue them relentlessly. The Israelis set a strategic trap, targeting the Egyptian army at its weakest, amid chaos and confusion.
The Mitla Pass was a massacre for the Egyptian army. Stretching 32 kilometers, it was flanked by mountains on both sides. No room to escape. Israeli aircraft struck both the entrance and exit of the pass, then unleashed continuous airstrikes as if it were a shooting range. With no air defense and no air cover, all that remained was anti-aircraft artillery, which proved utterly ineffective.
The Egyptian losses were devastating. The army lost nearly 80% of its 950 tanks. Over 750 tanks were either destroyed or rendered useless. Additionally, around 10,000 military vehicles were lost, including troop carriers and armored vehicles. 300 Egyptian warplanes were destroyed on the ground. In just the first day, following Israel's initial strike, Egypt suffered the loss of over 15,000 of its finest soldiers, including martyrs, missing, and unidentified casualties. Bodies and remains were scattered across the burning sands of Sinai, soaking its desert with the blood of fallen heroes. All that remained of vehicles and equipment were charred wrecks or abandoned machinery left behind in the chaotic retreat. Those who survived faced an even greater ordeal, traversing the unforgiving Sinai desert in a scorching summer that drained every ounce of breath. Struggling toward the banks of the canal, around 5,000 Egyptian soldiers were captured, some brutally killed as Israeli forces crushed them under the relentless wheels of their tanks.
The passes, if you wanted to withdraw the forces that had advanced deep into Sinai, were simply not enough. As a result, the vehicles became stuck, and the enemy began striking the forces positioned along the passes and main routes. The passes, rather than serving as pathways for movement, became deadly traps. This explains the immense losses in both personnel and equipment that took place within them.
Thousands of Egyptians were captured. An Israeli soldier filmed these scenes near El Arish airport. As the number of prisoners rose, the Israelis decided to keep the officers and technicians while releasing the other soldiers. On Thursday, June 8, 1967, soldiers began returning home after the chaotic retreat from Sinai. Each soldier had a story of defeat and destruction. The false claims of victory faded and disappeared. That evening Nasser, Ammar, and the army leaders met. Nasser, pale and heavy-hearted, told them he had no choice but to accept the UN ceasefire. 3 weeks earlier, Nasser's decision led to thousands of deaths and the loss of the army in Sinai. Now he had to face the people and explain. He gave his resignation speech.
I do not hide from you that we have suffered a grave setback in the past days, and I have made a decision that I want you to support me in. I have decided to step down completely and permanently from any official position and any political role, and to return to the ranks of the people, fulfilling my duty alongside them as any other citizen.
But before he finished, crowds filled the streets. They demanded Nasser stay in power. Hours later, Cairo radio announced Nasser would remain in office until the effects of the Israeli aggression were cleared. On June 9, 1967, the war ended. Israel now controlled Sinai, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. Next, Syria was in focus. Moshe Dayan feared an attack on Syria from the north due to the potential intervention of the Soviet Union, Syria's powerful ally. However, events took a different turn. Israeli intelligence intercepted a message from Nasser to Syrian President Nur al-Din al-Attasai, informing him of Nasser's agreement to ceasefire and save his army. As a result, Israeli forces confronted Syria along the border. The objective was to seize the strategic Golan Heights, under the pretext of securing Israeli borders and silencing Syrian artillery. On June 10, 1967, Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin sent a stern warning to the White House. The message said, "If you don't stop this, we will respond and consider unilateral military action." The Soviets began to act on their threat. Orders were given to the commander of the Soviet Air Force to remove the Soviet flag from his planes and prepare for combat. Soviet planes were equipped with bombs and missiles. In the Mediterranean Sea, the Soviet Navy moved toward the Israeli coast, aiming to attack the city and port of Haifa. The United States decided to send a military force to protect Israel from the Soviet army, not to fight Syria. At the time, the U.S. Sixth Fleet was conducting exercises in the Mediterranean, heading toward the Strait of Gibraltar. Orders were given to redirect the fleet to Israel to protect it from a potential Soviet attack. Amidst Soviet-American negotiations, Israel took advantage of the time. They captured the Syrian city of Quneitra, located 70 kilometers from Damascus. Israel then agreed to international pressure and accepted the ceasefire. The Israelis celebrated their victory over Egypt and the Arabs. Eshkol flew back from the Golan Heights in a helicopter to the new Israel. He watched the scene with awe but didn't grasp the consequences of this dangerous shift for Israel and the entire region until many months later. By the time he realized, the opportunity had passed. Levi Eshkol passed away 18 months after the war. The war officially ended at 6 p.m. on June 10, 1967. But as the guns fell silent, a new kind of war began. The Israeli government secretly started changing the face of Jerusalem, particularly at the most sensitive religious site in the world, the Western Wall beneath the Dome of the Rock. Half of the Moroccan quarter was destroyed. For decades, Israelis prayed at the Western Wall in a small space that could accommodate only a few dozen people. After the war, the situation changed drastically. The area was expanded by demolishing homes and expelling residents. The Western Wall shifted from a religious symbol to a national symbol of the Jewish state, marking the destruction of an Arab neighborhood that had existed for 700 years.